Hello and welcome to 2026 Scotland and Wales Election Analysis, a podcast jointly produced by the Fraser Valley Institute at Strathclyde University and the Wales Governance Centre at Cardiff University. And we are, as ever, grateful for the support of the Nuffield Foundation in funding this project. I'm João Sousa, and I'm Deputy Director of the Fraser Valley Institute, and today I'm joined by colleagues from the Wales Governance Centre, Poole and Guto Ifan, and by Ciara Crummey of the Fraser Valley Institute. Hi, Ciara.
Hi.
Now, this has been a busy week in terms of announcements. We've had our second manifesto drop in Scotland, but we've been slightly appended by manifestos in Wales because, apart from the Lib Dems, I think you guys now have all the main parties' manifestos. What did we learn from what we heard this week, Ed?
Been a whole load of stuff going on this week, and it came fast on the heels from the Conservatives and Reform UK being straight out of the blocks with their own manifestos. There's been a lot of focus on Plaid Cymru's manifesto and on the Greens manifesto. As you know, in the polls at the moment, looks like Plaid are in a leading position with Reform UK as the potential parties that might get the largest number of seats. So obviously there's been a lot of attention on Plaid's manifesto and you know how the sums work and all of that. Lots and lots of scrutiny by journalists and by the IFS and by other organisations on what that might mean. The big takeaway of the Plaid Cymru manifesto was, no surprise, it was about the childcare offer, which we can talk about with in a moment. But that was the main kind of goodie, electoral takeaway of that manifesto. Of course, a whole load of other really important issues being addressed in that manifesto, of course. But in terms of where the priority would be on additional funding that wasn't there at the moment, that was on childcare.
That leads in quite well with what we talked about in our previous episode about childcare in Wales. So can you talk us through what their announcement is and how much that might cost in additional spending?
Yeah, so Plaid Cymru are proposing to essentially expand the childcare offer on an universal basis to non-working parents as well, from the 20 hours per week for 3 to 4 year olds. So expanding that to younger children, essentially from age of 9 months and above. Crucially, it'd be sort of over 48 weeks of the year as well. So it would actually go further than in England. And as we talked about in the last podcast, there's been a big sort of expansion of the childcare offer in England. There's been a more gradual rollout, an expansion of a particular programme funded through what's called a Flying Start programme in Wales. But this would go further than what's been done in England. In terms of the cost of that, so I think Plaid Cymru have said by 2030-31 it would cost about £400 million per year. It'd be quite interesting maybe to know what they were sort of how they've modelled that. There's questions around take-up, for example. So in England, the take-up of whenever you expand services, that's been quite popular and it's proved more popular than sort of originally thought. So that might increase the cost a bit. But yeah, as Ed said, that's a sort of a key spending pledge and the main spending pledge of the manifesto. And it's actually quite similar then if you look at the Greens manifesto, which came out earlier in the week. They've got a very similar policy for children aged 9 months to 4 years old. But on top of that 20 hours, they have sort of a sliding scale of additional hours funded on the basis of people's incomes as well. But there's a lot of overlap in between of those policies. And it goes slightly further, does go further than what the Welsh Labour manifesto committed, and there's some differences as well to what the Welsh Conservatives proposed in the first week of the campaign.
This is obviously, you mentioned the fact that take-up is very important. So I guess this is and not to go too much into the weeds, but the way that this kind of allocations tend to happen, they tend to be out of a limit within which the Welsh government has to operate, which is what we call DEL, departmental expenditure limit. So that's kind of a set limit, which contrasts to other bits that are more kind of the way the UK government budgets for a lot of this stuff. Not for childcare, but for a lot of things that are demand driven, they tend to be on what's called annually managed expenditure, which has less strict limits because it tends to be more demand driven. I guess childcare is something that usually falls in within kind of a gray zone between these two things. But there's something here that I think is probably worth exploring in terms of how a Welsh government might have to budget for this, and the difficulty that it might face if it does prove to be more popular than they've anticipated. Because what happens if more parents want this than they've assumed?
Yeah, and on the other hand, there's going to be potentially capacity constraints as well within the sector in terms of getting people to work in the sector, recruitment, retaining staff, which actually might mean that the rollout might take a bit longer as well. So that's certainly been the case in the rollout that we've seen over recent years. The Welsh government actually took some funding out of what they'd originally allocated in some years in the middle of the last Senate term, because of the slower rollout and the lower demands. So yeah, there's quite a big deal of uncertainty around this, and there's the question, of course, of this is quite an expansion of the role of the state in this area. That means that you might not be able to do other stuff if you have to allocate more of the budget towards childcare over the course of the next Senate term. You might have to compromise, and there's some trade-offs in other areas as well.
One of the things that in the Plaid manifesto that I was interested by was, well, perhaps because I live in Scotland where this does exist, is potential creation of a child payment, which I think says it's something they want to explore. Is this something that has been mooted before in Wales? Is it something that kind of came out of blue, or what's kind of the context for this?
So it was something that Plaid Cymru, I think I'm right in saying, had proposed in the 2021 manifesto. There was a lot of different manifesto commitments. It was a much bigger, more sort of expansionist manifesto, I think it's fair to say, back in 2021 in a whole host of different areas. And this was sort of proposed. There is a question, of course, that because we don't have the social security powers, the devolved social security powers that the Scottish government got a decade ago, that means that you might have to think through how you deliver it, whether you deliver it through local authorities. I think there's a general sense, and it's sort of a lot of it being led by the Nuffield Foundation, the think tank that sort of focuses on poverty, that a lot of the, probably harshly you could call, sort of sticking plaster policies that the Welsh government just sort of produce a myriad of different interventions to sort of try and tackle child poverty, and it hasn't really shifted the dial. So I guess that there is a sense that we need to try something different, or the Welsh government needs to try something different, and that's sort of looking at a policy in Scotland which has had a measurable effect on child poverty. Direct cash payments to families might be an option to explore. Of course, within the current powers that the Welsh government has, and within the sort of fiscal envelope, it might be quite difficult to achieve that. And so it is only a pilot that they are sort of proposing. So 15,000, so payments to 15,000 children, or at some point over the course of the next Senate term.
What have been some of the major issues in Scotland coming this week?
So I think the one of the major ones has been the announcement of the Scottish Conservative Manifesto, and I think Ciara has been doing a lot of digging through it and seeing how much things cost. So I'll let her speak. There's also been this has been a little bit of bugbear of mine. There's been a lot of discussion about things that aren't devolved, which they obviously matter for the people, particularly in the northeast of Scotland, in terms of oil and gas exploration. And there are some areas around planning, for example, where the Scottish government can and does have an influence over how easily, for example, if there's offshore wind exploration, how that gets transported to the onshore bit of Scotland. But I think all the discussion about should you back Rosebank and Jackdaw, the two main oil fields that oil and gas fields that got expansion licenses. A lot that's all reserved, and so it's the same thing that we say when there are general elections, when lots of folk in different parties talk about the NHS up here in Scotland. That's a devolved matter. This is when we should be talking about all the devolved stuff that sometimes gets talked about in general elections. This is the time for it. So there's a bit of cross-pollination of the unhelpful kind, I think. But I think Ciara's got the lowdown on the Scottish Tory manifesto, which has got quite a lot of proposals, actually, hasn't it?
Yes, there's quite a lot in quite a meaty manifesto, but I guess probably the main takeaway from it is some big tax cuts proposed, funded through cuts to welfare spending and kind of other proposed efficiency savings. The kind of main takeaway with income tax is they're proposing quite a lot of cuts, including introducing a 0% band, which will extend the personal allowance, so the amount that you can earn before you pay tax. Also reducing the basic and the intermediate rates to 19%, so they're at the same level as the starter rate. And by the end of the Parliament, increasing the higher rate threshold to be in line with that of the UK. So overall, these cuts would bring a lot much closer alignment to the UK system, and it would mean that across the board, all taxpayers in Scotland would be paying less tax because of these kind of cuts at the bottom end of the distribution. However, it's a very costly policy to have tax cuts for everyone. We estimate that it's going to cost around £125 million this year, rising to up to nearly £2.5 billion by the end of the Parliament. So kind of to have big tax cuts like that, you're going to have to fund it from somewhere else. And the manifesto does set out quite a lot of these kind of savings they are planning. The main one being cuts to welfare spending. They're very kind of deliberate in the manifesto that this is where they want to make the savings to use the funding elsewhere. The big one being cuts to ADP, which is adult disability payments. So they are proposing tightening the eligibility for this payment so that less people are in receipt of it and they can make a lot of savings there. The main change here being introducing new mental health assessments for those with mental health conditions as the reason for receiving disability payments, so that people will need specifically medically diagnosed mental health conditions in order to receive the claims now. And they've estimated this could save around £2 billion per year by the end of the Parliament. But I think it's quite important to note that these savings that they have planned with the welfare spending, they're very dependent on how people are going to respond to the changes. So if, for example, this £2 billion is based on a set number of people that don't have a medically diagnosed condition who are currently receiving the benefit, if they were to then go and get that medical diagnosis, they would now be eligible. So those savings, we don't know whether or not they are included or excluded in these kind of calculations in the manifesto. But if that saving is what's needed to fund things like these big tax cuts, it leads to a lot of uncertainty around whether or not things like these tax cuts are going to be affordable in practice if the Conservatives were to come to power.
It seems, in some sense, not that dissimilar to the 2025 spring statement around then when the UK government proposed, big cuts to what's called PIP, or Personal Independence Payment. It's the equivalent of adult disability payment here. But then it was kind of like, it seemed like driven by a fiscal forecast that just wasn't as good. This is different in the sense that this seems specific policy to fund tax cuts across the board. In many cases, the tax cut, the bigger cash benefits will accrue to those on higher incomes, funded by cutting benefits for people who are quite a lot further down on the income distribution. So there's a distributional consequence there. There's also like a deliverability point, and obviously different parties would have different backbenchers and different interest groups that might have more sway. But I think it proved generally quite unpopular what was being proposed in 2025 because the big row, and so it's difficult to see how this could fully be deliverable. And as Ciara said, if you require people to have fewer diagnosed, medically diagnosed conditions to be able to access this, then they don't necessarily need to go and do that. But it's perfectly reasonable to assume that a lot of people would meet the threshold, and in which case all this does is increase activity to not really save very much money at all. The other thing that appears to be something that everyone is saying they want to do is efficiencies, efficiency gains. They've got a clever acronym. It's the Scottish Agency for Value-Added Efficiency, which abbreviates to SAVE. Plaudits for the cunning acronym, but there's a lot of wishful thinking about efficiencies, and we've heard from several parties, not just the Conservatives, Reform have talked about this, Scottish Labour have talked about this. To be fair, the current Scottish government, the SNP, have talked about this as well, that they want to rationalise the parliamentary bodies and improve public sector productivity. I guess the problem with all of this is that it feels very much like everyone's saying things that they know are important, but we are yet to see a plan as to how this actually translates into, saving money on delivering the same level of services. And I guess that's the key thing, is that it's perfectly reasonable to be interested in having lower taxes. Particularly reasonable to be interested in having higher government spending. Perfectly reasonable to shift the balance between the two, and the areas in which you're going to spend money. But most of these efficiency savings have a pretty terrible track record of delivering lower costs.
Just to jump in there, I mean, I suppose it's not a bad thing to have targets for efficiency savings in a sense. I think one of the things that we've criticised in the Welsh context is that, unlike the UK and Scotland, the Welsh government doesn't really have a detailed set of assumptions for productivity improvements and efficiency savings going forward. And you would think in things like, given AI, for example, there's potential there for there to be some significant potentially efficiency savings. But I think your point is that you need to be clear about where these savings are going to come from, rather than just have a line in the spreadsheet that's going to save you some money.
Exactly, because I guess the trouble comes if you don't meet those targets and you're pinning your budget balancing on meeting them, then something's got to give there, right? And our experience over the last few years here in Scotland has been lots of, we'll stop the spending when things are running ahead of schedule. We'll stop the spending that we can stop. I mean, that is one way to prioritize things, but that's not a particularly efficient way of prioritizing things, because you kind of no longer in the realm of stopping the spending that you think isn't necessary, and you're kind of bound by the kind of ugly reality of, we're going to stop, I don't know, people from traveling from one office to the other, even though that might increase collaboration and increase efficiency, for example, by having this cross-site locations, and you're just saying, well, but people don't have to travel, so just don't pay for those expenses. Whereas whatever's just been incurred, even if it was wasteful, is already been incurred, then we can't do anything about it. So that's the sort of knee-jerk reaction that is perfectly understandable if you have a very hard cutoff by which you have to meet your budget targets. But to do this in a way that's kind of more thought through would mean that you'd be able to do that prioritization beforehand rather than afterwards if the savings do pan out. I mean, obviously you mentioned AI, that would be great if that would bring loads of productivity improvements. And it might well do, but I don't think we can bank on that happening immediately.
So what's coming up next week in Scotland? Busy week? Manifestos?
We don't know yet when some of the other manifestos will drop, and to be honest, some of the parties have a track record for dropping them quite late, but we're getting pretty close to polling day, so we'd hope to see a few more.
Well, Wales has been really ahead of the curve on all of that. We've 5 major parties manifestos out, and the Liberal Democrats coming next week. So yeah, we're all done and dusted almost.
Yeah. I think we're definitely trailing in that regard, but hopefully we see more of this in the coming week.
Look forward to it.
All right, so that's all we have time for today. So thank you very much for listening, and do keep an eye out for further analysis on our websites, including analysis of the manifestos as they, after they've come out. But for now, all that's left for me to do is to say thank you to our colleagues, and we will see you soon.